They locked her in the dark box, where she spent hours. How many? She did not know. Time dissolved into darkness and isolation, did not pass in a linear or concrete way, had to be different than for the rest of the world. Time expanded and contracted before her, made a mystery of itself. How much of it passed? What felt like days could have just as well been minutes, crammed into the smallest space. In no more than a 1.5 by 1.5 meter cube, she outlasted the uncertainty. The silence. Not a noise came from outside. Neither did any of her sounds reach the outside. No one heard her cry. Somehow, air had to get to her. Otherwise, she would have suffocated by now. Repeatedly, a cramp arose in her right calf. It subsided again and again, did not remain constant, but returned incessantly. She never got rid of it completely. It became part of her ordeal. In her restriction, she could only try to loosen it by regularly adjusting her position. Alone with her thoughts, she wondered what had happened to Asta. She doubted that she was in a similar box. After all, they had never seen another one of them.
Probably, she's being tortured,
she thought regretfully, having to move her leg at that moment to alleviate her own torture.
Or she has already been shot.
She feared that she would suffer the same fate as long as no one came to free her. She thought that was extremely unlikely. There was extremely little optimism emerging in her box. Her faith in the future dwindled with every extended second. Her ordeal came to an unexpected end when the lid was lifted. The glaring daylight blinded her for a moment. Hands reached for her and pulled her out. Only the firm grip let KLEIO melt back into this reality. He hurled her out of the microcosm and the loneliness of her thoughts, back into the events of an external world. She feared that this was merely the first phase of her punishment. Only the executioner would free her. Ultimately, she would long for it, so that she could escape the Laxarian terror. What happened instead undermined any expectation on her part. On the gravel, and parked right next to the black box, stood a streamlined vehicle ready. Chrome-plated and noble materials formed a limousine straight out of a 60s flick. A parahistoric Cadillac. A driver in grey threads and blue gloves gestured to the back door, and for KLEIO to get in. For a moment she looked around, still decidedly groggy, wanting to make sure of the reaction of the bystanders. One of the soldiers immediately revealed that she had not imagined the chauffeur's wordless request. "Get in! Now!" he ordered, and KLEIO followed without resistance. As her buttocks sunk into the dark upholstery, she felt as if she were sitting on clouds. Never before had a seat seemed so comfortable. She thought she could fall asleep right away, her whole body sighing in relief. Only her head would not allow it. The rear area, where KLEIO sat, was separated from that of the chauffeur. Thus, no conversation with him came about, in which it would have been revealed what in at least this world was going on here. Silently, the limousine rolled out of the prison camp. Her first escape might have failed. Now she was leaving behind the worst she had ever experienced, and in comparison, this escape was uneventful. Her circumstances took a turn for the better, even though her status as a prisoner remained. The ride slid along cobbled streets of a city unfamiliar to KLEIO, while destruction disfigured the outskirts of the metropolis almost beyond recognition. This road led them through an autumnal wonder. She marveled at the alien architecture through the limousine's window. At the same time, it was strangely familiar. She saw elements of Renaissance and antiquity, but not as if antiquity had been rediscovered with the Renaissance, but as if their understanding of beauty had never been lost. Playful buildings of marble, sandstone, and granite mingled with wood, as well as modern aesthetics of shimmering glass and metal, silver, copper, and gold tones. Magnificently ornate buildings that looked like a mixture of ancient temples and postmodern architecture were held by impressive columns and archways. The buildings of a cosmopolitan miracle shone immaculately. Seemingly unaffected by the consequences of war, also the number of passers-by not wearing uniforms increased. They passed crowds of people simply living their daily lives, bustling through the alleyways, standing and sitting together. On the way, they passed a pedestrian zone that was literally overflowing with life. People were sitting on terraces of restaurants, drinking and chatting, eating and laughing. Businesses were clustered on both sides. Operating as usual despite Laxarian occupation, the limousine pushed further into the center. Next to them, the buildings became higher and higher and more pompous. Periodically, the limousine passed checkpoints. They simply waved them through and asked no questions. KLEIO remembered how the prisoner transport had to identify itself everywhere. This car had to belong to a big shot. They turned into a path and drove along an avenue of cherry blossoms. The houses at the edge gleamed in the sunlight. Frescoes and colorfully painted sculptures, covered with gold, reflected the fire from above. She could not remember when she had ever experienced such an abundance of splendor. At most in the Palace of Versailles and similar evidences of decadence, and never in an entire city district. The limousine stopped in front of the most magnificent home in the neighborhood. KLEIO heard the chauffeur get out and unlock the door before he opened it. Even the air here seemed better than that in the camp. She took a deep breath and stretched her limbs, somewhat restoring the feeling of freedom. She marveled at the building. Bronze ivy wound its way up the walls and pillars. The door of the urban fairy tale castle opened, and the butler of the house came out to grant KLEIO admission.
"Don't be shy,"
he said, and continued as if she must know who he was talking about.
"Geoff of the Collegiate wants to see you immediately."
Just then, she considered running away, even though she would not get very far before the soldiers would pick her up. After that, the box would be the least she had to face. She therefore took the path fate had in store for her. Over the threshold onto a marble floor, immediately hearing how the heavy wooden door fell into the lock. To describe the entrance area from the inside as luxurious could not possibly do justice to the degree to which this luxury was composed. Everything was made of the finest fabrics, carpets of exotic animal skins over the stone floor. Priceless objects of art from styles KLEIO did not know lined the walls, giving the impression of a private museum. She simply assumed that the things were priceless, because fakes and cheap imitations would have been at odds with what this home exuded. The butler snapped his fingers, causing her attention to shift from the furnishings to him again.
"Geoff is not one to be kept waiting. Now, if you will follow me..."
Even if she didn't like his arrogant tone, she wanted to find out why they brought her here. She followed him up a spiral staircase to the upper floor, through a magnificently decorated corridor, past huge rooms, whole halls full of splendor and treasures. Flowers and plants around matte yellow and marble walls and columns gave it a playful colorfulness. Ornaments of lapis lazuli and amber were refined with gold. From the street, it had already looked like one of the larger houses in the area, but it blended in so well with the neighborhood that it could never be guessed how far the rooms went into its rear areas. They passed a library where some people were browsing. Overall, the complex was extremely busy. Everywhere they passed people, in uniforms or robes of the faith. Everywhere KLEIO recognized the emblem of Ispatian. They reached a dark wooden door. The butler knocked 3 times before a man's angry voice sounded behind it.
"What is it again?"
"She is here, sire,"
the butler spoke obsequiously.
"So let her enter, Zero,"
commanded the stranger, allowing KLEIO to enter the hallowed spheres. She came into an office room. Dark furniture was covered with stacks of documents and books. The window offered a view of the city of Keltoin. In front of it stood a massive desk. Someone sat at it, wrapped in cigar smoke. The smoke dissipated to reveal a plump fellow, sunk in his velvet armchair, wearing jewelry, rings, gold, and chains. He grinned as if a crime boss had landed in the Pope's chair. A phallic headgear was emblazoned with the symbols of Ispatian. His sausage mitt snapped the cigar out of his mouth and guided it to a golden ashtray on the table, where he idly flicked off the ash.
"Leave us,"
he told his butler, and he abjectly departed, closing behind him.
"Sit down,"
he ordered her calmly, and she settled into the chair opposite. In the overalls and dirt of a prisoner in front of one of those who were responsible for all this, KLEIO already read it in his get-up, the way she was brought here. Therefore, she did not show him much sympathy, let alone due respect.
You're even prettier than I was told, even under all that dirt.
His eyes grew wider with each syllable.
Why was I brought here?
She thought nothing of flattery.
Straight to the point. I like that.
He replied, taking a drag from the cigar.
I am Geo-4, eminence of the spiritual collegiate of Ispat.
A pause followed for dramatic effect. Despite all the masses, KLEIO could poorly place what it meant. What she knew was enough for her, that he was at the head of this system that captured people and locked them in camps in the most adverse conditions. He continued,
You are here because you are not of this world. The girl Asta confessed everything. What she and her Taurdian conspirators tried to do. That instead you emerged from their forbidden rituals. And I must admit, until now, I had difficulty believing it to be true, even if they had to torture this heretic to death. And she stuck to her opinion to the end. Now that you are sitting in front of me, I believe her. May Ispat judge her soul.
With the gruesome revelation of what had happened to Asta, he performed a gesture, drew a square in the air, and gently cut it in two, which was the Ispatian equivalent of making the sign of the cross. KLEIO tried to keep her composure. She did not know the girl very well, and Asta had never been very trusting of her. Nevertheless, she blamed herself for another victim that the conflict was claiming, as in any reality in which people were at war with each other. History repeated itself, even in other worlds.
If you didn't believe her, why am I sitting here?
An amused laugh came over him, followed by a cough.
I'm glad she defied my conviction. For before me sits a young woman who was picked up by our troops as part of the Taurdian conspirators and converses with me flawlessly in Abramic, the hallowed language of our collegiate,
He said, as if he found it hard to believe.
Even members of our upper class have difficulty expressing themselves in it, or just even understanding it. And you sit before me, just a few years ago a child, and speak with the same tongue with which Ispat himself once spoke.
Busted,
thought KLEIO, not knowing how to talk her way out of it. In his sacred language, it was hard to deny. It was advisable to come to terms with the new situation, even if it was uncertain how it would develop. After all, according to the Ispatian view, it declared her to be something like the devil, or at least a demon. She should have been burned instantly for the abomination she was in their belief. However, if Geo-4 knew about this and had her brought here in spite of everything, hereby were not served the official interests of his faith. He rose ponderously from his throne and stepped over to the wall next to her. There was a map of the world, which at first glance corresponded to that of KLEIO. Territories were marked on it, reminding her of Cold War graphics, albeit with unusual borders. The entire Eastern Hemisphere was colored in a beige and held a foreign coat of arms. The African continent was under a different symbol and was, at the Mediterranean coastline along the Middle East, wrapped in a dark turquoise. South America presented itself up to Panama under the sign of a flower and in a lush green. Throughout North America, the west coast of Africa and large parts of Europe were dominated by the flag of the Laxarians and the banner of Ispat, while in the heart of Europe, between France and Hungary, down the Mediterranean coast, a patch of red remained. KLEIO squinted her eyes a little and recognized a layer of paint. That white had been subsequently applied.
The map doesn't look like this for long,
She thought.
Progress has turned our view of the world upside down in the past 3 decades.
Geo-4 spoke. KLEIO thought that she must have played her part too, since when she arrived, time was going crazy. He continued to review.
Technology led us to victory, not faith. We had to bend our faith to progress in order for it to survive. The development of our war machine, use of cosmic frequencies and inexhaustible energies would once have contradicted our beliefs. Today they are celebrated as gifts of Ispat, and rightly so. We have neutralized the weapon technology of the Taurdians with our science. Their practices are ineffective as long as the signal exists, and the Armabella 415 carry it to the battlefield. And yet the heretics still managed to bring you here. They conjured you as one of their devils. I wonder why. Only their leader knew.
Under his bushy eyebrows, he looked sternly at her, as if she knew the reason.
200 years ago, we were driven out of our own land as outlaws because the ruling elite of their clans refused to recognize the teachings of Ispat and conspired against us. After years of struggle for survival, we found a new home in the West, but we had to take it and defend it with our blood. But we succeeded. We brought the heritage of Ispat to a new flowering. And since his children discovered the wonders of his sciences for themselves, weapons for his warriors and goods for his workers, nothing can stand in the way of his sacred cause. We bring blood and fire back to the land of his origin, and thus cure it of the blasphemous offenses of the devils who banished us, so that here too, the glory of Ispat may flourish.
Why are you telling me all this? Why the history lesson?
A grin settled on the swollen visage.
Some of my revered members of the Collegiate, including me, who are a bit more cosmopolitan, see you as another revelation. You are a sign from the one God that we must set our sights even higher, beyond the limits of this world.
So what does that mean for me now?
She feared that she would now become the research object of their experiments. Rumors about this had circulated enough in the camp. His Eminence folded his hands in his lap and thought.
I don't think you are a threat, though appearances may be deceiving. Ispat teaches us that things are usually as they appear, but I know that you are not of this world. I want to have you around for a while, and study you until I know what further needs to be done with you.
Then I'm your pet now?
The question came more bitingly from her lips than she had intended, and she did not know how much sarcasm was understood in that language, but he laughed downright sickeningly.
That, and much more,
he replied with a smile.
There is a feast here tonight to celebrate the triumph of Ispat. Some important people from all over the world have been invited, and the progress of Ispat will open their eyes. I want you to dress up for the occasion.
KLEIO thought she didn't hear right. Was she now being paraded as an accessory? Contrary to her spontaneous inclination, she didn't talk back. All the better than being shot or locked in a box was it to dress up and go to a banquet. She had experienced both firsthand, so the decision was easy. Apparently, the old man was less strict with the commandments of his faith than expected from the common folk. He wanted to find out more about this phenomenon, her. The fact that this phenomenon flattered his yellow eyes was conducive to the cause. Stay tuned for weekly chapters. Like, share, and subscribe for more wacky adventures. We thank you for your support.